Hi there, and thank you for clicking on this video. In the stream that I was doing the other day, Vlad Ministrator asked a really good question, and I don't think I explained it very well, so we'll be making an independent video on it. They asked, can you explain diminishing returns? Um, and the explanation that I gave was accurate, based on like how to like increase DPS on weapons. And for like the past day, I've been trying to figure out the easiest way to explain diminishing returns without going into a bunch of math. Because frankly, people's eyes glaze over. You're either into that stuff or you're not. And the single biggest explanation of why you just shouldn't even bother with double stacking specific stats is because frankly, you don't have the mod space. Okay. So with weapons, generally across the board, and this is going to be a million man hour presentation. So you have, okay, black, your DPS, right? Damage per second. This is the total formula for it, more or less. And you have specific categories of things that fall into it. Like the first one is the base damage of the weapon. So the weapon itself. And the clearest direct upgrade is just going to be base damage mods. It's going to be directly on top, a direct boost to whatever the weapon's stats. And this is going to be things like Serration. And heavy fill in the blank. Can also be like Spoiled Strike on melees. And for the most part, you're just going to slot in whatever gives you the most damage. Obviously, there are special circumstances where you would want one over the other, but for the most time, oh, and also Hornet Strike. And if we're doing melee, also Pressure Point. It's going to be a direct upgrade, and for the most time when you're doing like Starchart and beginning out on Steel Path, as you collect Steel Path Arcanes, things are going to change a little bit. But your go-tos when you're first starting out is going to be Serration, Hornet Strike, Pressure Point, and Point Blank for shotties. I think that's it. So Serration, Hornet Strike, Pressure Point, Point Blank. They all do the same thing, but they're for specific weapons. It literally just takes the weapon, whatever you're using, and just adds an even damage amount across the board. The next category that we have, and this is going to be for like projectile weapons, basically everything that's not melee, is going to be multi-shot. It's going to be like your galvanize, like your diffusion, lethal torrents, stuff like that. And it is another direct multiplier to whatever the weapon was. 100 pennies on the dollar, whatever is there, that's how much your damage goes up. So say if the mod says like plus 120%, your damage goes up 120%. So if you deal 100 damage and you add a plus 120% multi-shot mod, you're doing 220 damage per second, or times whatever your fire rate is. Which is the next category. Look at our paintbrush. The next category, and this is damage per second, so this is a damage over time calculation, is going to be fire rate. And this is the same thing in terms of DPS. It is a straight up multiplier to your damage per second. You will not see the benefit of your DPS because the info panel in Warframe doesn't show estimated damage per second. Kind of wish it did. But you obviously will get to see the fire rate turn green, right? So your DPS, the damage output that you do, will be directly multiplied by this. The next category, and this might be the first time you've heard it described this way, but you know exactly what it is your average crit multiplier. And this requires 2 mods. Crit chance and crit damage. And your average crit multiplier is, again, a direct multiplier to the base of the weapon. We haven't done anything but boost the weapon itself. Okay. The next one is going to be elements. You're going to pick an element based on the enemy. Viral or gas against infested. Viral against basically most Starchart enemies is a really solid choice. But viral specifically against Grenier when you full strip. Radiation against the Murmur. Magnetic against shields. Though that is a special case. But if you're looking for a raw damage increase, you just pick whatever is the plus 75. Ideally, you want to use one mod, but we are talking about diminishing returns, and we're going to talk specifically why modding for 2 elements, or using 2 mod spaces for elements is justified. We are going to go to the wiki real quick. Your weakness. Where's that tab at? Here we go. Okay, so we're going to use the Grenier's example. Corrosive against the Grenier is really effective. Radiation is also pretty effective against the more elite units. But the reason why you go corrosive is because even though you don't get the damage bonus against alloy armor, you do still get the armor shred, which is fine. But the reason being is that when you mod for 2 elements, it's not just a singular damage bonus, where if you were to do cold electricity, heat, toxin, you would get like a single thing. The combo elements tend to do multiple things at once. So even though you're modding for you sacrificing 2 mod slots, you're gaining 1 more elemental modded weight on the weapon. So the multiplier to your base damage, which is what the elements sit on top of. So the total elemental weighting, a lot of times this is going to be like plus 90, or if you do both, it'll be plus 180. And you will see this in the modded screen. So base damage, multi-shot, you won't see it affect the average crit multiplier, but the green number that you see at the bottom where it shows like total, base damage, multi-shot, and elemental weighting will all stack on top of each other for the combined element. So base damage, whatever the base damage is of the weapon, like the original unmodded base damage, and then you have the modded base damage, which is Serration. Multi-shot will further increase that, and you'll see that in the tooltip. And then the elemental will then get added on. Now, they stack additively with each other, the elements. So the 90 and 90, you're not going to have like, it's going to be 180. So say if the unmodded base damage of your weapon is 100, you add 290 mods, your base damage, or your modded damage, is now 280. So they add together, and then that combined total affects your base damage. So this takes two mod slots also. Our other big multipliers are faction, and you can already see a problem just by throwing essentially one mod into each stat. So we have one base damage, one multi-shot, one fire rate, two mods for crit multiplier, and two for element. And we're already at 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And faction would again directly increase our base damage. Now, it depends on what enemies you're going up against, but faction is kind of the mod slot that you have to toy with. So we can see, and so, honestly, faction doesn't show in the tooltip either. So we're going to use the Bazoprime just due to polarities. We're going to do base damage, which is Serration. Multi-shot, split chamber, so this is plus 90, so you can see the plus 90. If you take it off, you can see it's 42. Multi-shot shows here. And then we'll do, because we're going to be shooting Grenier, we'll do corrosive. We are going to use 60s for polarity reasons. And you can see the damage gets adjusted. You can even see the corrosive weighting. The next thing is going to be fire rate. We'll do something like speed trigger. And now we need to get our crit multiplier, which is going to be vital sense. And for the time being, point strike. So we haven't added in faction, and we have a flex slot. So this is, in terms of like not dealing with dots, just trying to get your DPS as high as possible. Like the core non-conditional modding setup. Your mod your mod setup is basically filled. The Exilus is a utility. 99 times out of 100, it's going to be an ammo mutation. So that one's essentially spoken for also. Obviously, if you're using like a weapon that has like a battery on it, where it recharges, you've got some flexibility. There's also some special circumstances, like say the Null, where you really don't need the ammo mutation. You're going for a headshot, and then it has a quirk that gives it unlimited ammo. So, besides special circumstances, 99 times out of 100, this is going to be an ammo mutation of some sort. So this one's spoken for also. So in terms of like diminishing returns, most builds are spoken for. Okay, it's just the way Warframe, or not Warframe is, because of the way the multipliers are. There really isn't much you can change about this, unless the weapon can't take advantage of crit because the base stats are too low, or doesn't have the ability to take care proc statuses, where like the status chance is too low. Like say it's like I don't know, like the Sea-Doo main shot or something. But then because it has the gimmick, you can take advantage of that to get statuses. But the main shot doesn't. Another example would kind of be the like the Soma has a kind of low status chance. So you would tend to just bullet hose the statuses, or you make it like a really strong crit weapon, right? So for most builds, this is kind of it, right? Like there's not much you can change about this. You're gonna have your base damage, you're gonna have your multi-shot, crit damage, crit chance. We can organize this a little more. Okay, so base damage, multi-shot, fire rate, crit damage, crit chance. However you want to do it. Mentally, I always do it this way. So these 4 mods are practically a given. Speed trigger, like your fire rate mods, really kind of depends on whether the weapon fires fast enough or not. Most of the time, you're going to be slotting this in. A lot of times, including me, shred or prime shred, because punch through does multiply your total DPS output, but it has the condition of you need to line up enemies. So most of you are going to be using speed trigger unless you got prime shred and you're enjoying the Forma cost, right? But these four mods here are going to be on most builds, or at least a mod that takes care of these buffs, right? The element is dependent on what you're shooting, and you kind of have a flex slot. What you see a lot of people do, me included, like especially against the Grineer, is you'll slot like 100 munitions here and go like corrosive 100 munitions, and source viral from something else. Like I've been using the Panzer for a long time now, to get viral onto enemies, because if you're bullet hosing enemies, you tend to not really care too much about what status you have on them, as long as you're proccing the right one. Like if you're gonna bullet hose, like and you have a bunch of multi-shot, you're gonna get your statuses on a bullet hose weapon where it has like a really high fire rate. So this is generally the gist. You really don't have a lot of room to even entertain diminishing returns. So if you are worried about diminishing returns, frankly, if you've modded correctly, it's just not an issue. It really just isn't that big of an issue. Now there are some things, and we'll talk about like a melee setup, where it depends on like where the weapon is, and we'll go into that a little bit. Diminishing returns because it's more prevalent there. But for primaries, the issue is kind of solved. Okay, so not a big deal. Let's go ahead and shoot some stuff. Because the best way to deal with it is to just kind of shoot stuff and test. Like, it's why we have the simulacrum. You should be using the simulacrum. If you're not, alright, good enough. So, really standard Starchart setup. Nothing fancy. Even the Panzer is available on the regular Starchart. I need enemies. Get some body shots in. So 110 on a body shot with corrosive stacked. $660 on a headshot. Slash procs are in the thousands. Not a big deal. Obviously, the viral from the Panzers helping us out tremendously. So pretty basic. Now, one of the issues that comes in, so that's it for the Starchart, is we're gonna use mods that do the exact same thing, but they change because we have better versions. Once you get to Steel Path, you unlock the Steel Path Arcane slot. Your go-to most of the time is going to be Primary Merciless. Okay, if you're dealing with a dot build, your base damage is Merciless, but the floor to your base damage most of the time is going to be Galvanized Aptitude. We get some status chance with this, which is super nice. It also allows us, if you're dealing with a bullet hose, to run dual 90s pretty safely. The next upgrade is going to be Split Chamber. It goes to Galvanized Chamber. And let's get rid of that. Point Strike, which is our crit chance, goes to Critical Delay. So we'll keep everything lined up. 100 munitions, and we'll get our corrosive back. So pretty basic. And if you have shred, you can slot it there. If you, or regular shred. Let me see if I can fit a regular one on. Yep. Okay, so fire rate's down a little bit because we went from plus 60 on speed trigger to shred, but now we're gaining the punch through stat. So let's see how we do. Come on, buddy. Spit. Alright. Let's get some headshots to stack up our conditionals. Alright, so with this, it's fine because the damage is so large, but the galvanized damage mod and merciless are technically, you know, buffing the same stat sometimes. But for most of the weapons, they're directly in line with each other. Now, the thing is that because the buffs are so large, they at least double your damage. Or the galvanized damage mod will at least double your damage, so it's okay. And it basically comes down to what diminishing returns ultimately is that if you mod for two things, the damage bonus is less than if you had just modded for a different stat. Right? Like, so there's another mod that you could slot in there that gives you a bigger damage increase. So why aren't you modding for that? Is basically the philosophy. So this is sort of like a pseudo okay setup. It's very bullet hosey, but obviously it's a Bazo. It's kind of meant to do that. And we can fit shred now. Sword damage goes up even more. But the thing about the damage diminishing returns is that it's like self-nerfing the weapon when you could just put a better mod slot in there. So as long as you stick to the basics, like most of your mods are spoken for. Okay. So all of them, 100 munitions is taking advantage of the characteristic of armor where slash can bypass it. Or I guess in this case, taking advantage of slash because it bypasses armor. So it's effective against armor. But the rest of these mods, now whether or not you go viral or not is up to you. It's certainly effective. But 100 munitions is always really solid against the Grenier. Bypasses ferrite armor, bypasses alloy armor. So it's just kind of, you put two of your elements into dealing with whatever the enemy's scaling damage resistance is, whatever the enemy uses to scale, and then you sacrifice, and then you do another slot to deal with whatever does the most damage to them. So things like gas slash, gas heat, gas electric are good against the infested. You can even run like magnetic toxin setups, provided you massively weight the toxin, just to help burn down the enemies faster. But most of the time with that, people end up just going pure toxin, right? And just faction mod into it. But obviously there are special circumstances that are exceptions to this, and frankly, they are starting to become more relevant nowadays. But this is the general modding for like diminishing returns. Is it's ultimately just not an issue. Now, one of the questions that was asked was dealing with like diminishing returns because of arcanes. We do have things now like frostbite, where on cold status effect you gain crit damage and multi-shot. Now, each of these stats on their own is definitely a direct increase. Don't get it twisted. It's a direct increase. Let's see. Corrosive, if I can spell it. Toxin. And then cryo to get cold. And in this situation, a lot of times I find myself taking off Vital Sense just to get the modded weighting back on. But obviously that isn't too big of an issue. Okay, I got polarity issues. There we go. And Serration. So even though it's weaker, modded wise, it's about the same because I have to put Serration back on, and because it's a rifle, it basically cuts your damage in half. It's not as bad as, say, like on a shotgun, where point blank is like plus 90, and like prime point blank is like 165 or something. It's not as bad as on shotguns, but here, it's a little bit more palatable because we also get the elemental bonus of primed cryo, right? So this is raw damage. We did take a little bit of a hit just because of polarities on crit. So let's go ahead and get these guys back. Our damage is going to be a little bit more up front. But the biggest thing is we don't have a dot now. I mean, we are going to proc a little bit. But the raw damage, once it starts scaling, still gets pretty high. At least it's an enjoyable play style, right? So it's a little bit of a different play style. It ends up being a little bit more even because you have the additional cold weighting. You'll notice it against, and I can show that. You'll notice it against alloyed enemies. What do we got? Let's see, bombards. And once we get stacked up, it's not too bad. Obviously, it looks good when it does that. Alright, body shots. Yeah, see, it's still not too bad. For just weapon buffs, no armor strip, really, besides corrosive stacks. So the main thing is that when you mod for something, you need to get something, and you have to compare it to whatever else you could be putting there. And it is kind of an experience call, but it's not that big of a deal, right? So most of the builds on primaries are spoken for, same with secondaries. Let's talk about melees. Because there is a ton of conditionals on these for meta builds. Okay. So the stances multipliers, you're not going to see it in the tooltip. Again, base damage, where we would have fire rate, you have attack speed, we'll do a prime fury so you can see it. Crit chance, This is going to be a conditional. It goes up as you gain combo. Crit damage. So we have our same thing. And our pseudo multi-shot is going to be reach. Where with primaries, you would shoot more bullets. With melees, you hit more enemies. So pretty simple. And then you've got your modding for whatever the element is. So we would do like a corrosive. Pretty basic. With this, we could do a primed. And then we have like a flex slot. Is the general gist for like a raw damage build. So even on melees, your build's pretty much spoken for. Now, what a lot of times you'll see, I know I'm guilty of this, is a lot of times for general use, you'll see people go double crit damage. Because the Gladiator Might has 2 stats on it. It also gains crit chance on combo counter. And occasionally you'll see people running Strike, even though that is getting less common because we're in sort of the primary and secondary meta right now. At least until these arcanes get nerfed. For the melees, we're kind of in the melee meta right now because they're just so absurdly strong. But traditionally, this would be like a generic build, right? You would go double crit damage, or you for slower weapons, you would go double attack speed, so 1.8. And we can see that. So it's the same philosophy. Not a big deal. So pretty basic. It scales decently, even on Steel Path. Those are going to be tougher enemies than you would on average encounter. So this would be like a generic build. It wouldn't. This is obviously not like specialized to the Oma, right? So even on melees, you're generally along the same lines, right? Most of the build is spoken for. And this is a raw damage build. The next thing you would want is you would want to start worrying about like statuses. And then you would do this. So before it was getting your status by volume. Now and we'll test it out. You'll see how the damage increases. We'll get more statuses and we'll start shredding enemies faster. And giving condition overload more to chew on faster. Wait for our boy to spit. There we go. And we're just getting corrosive procs that much faster, which is causing the armor shred to go up. Or the armor shred to be stacked faster. Yeah, 2 swings, 10 stacks. With more attack speed, it would shred. So even faster. And we took off attack speed and a glad mod. So even on this, most of the build is spoken for. So now when diminishing returns really comes in, is when you start including things like arcanes, and it's more of an issue because of what the arcanes are, and it depends on the bonus, right? So we're starting to build up these guys. I'm waiting on Crescendo and Duplicate, so are most people. Depending on what the arcane is, like melee exposure adds corrosive, retaliation offers a huge damage bonus. Melee Influence, which is pretty popular, uh, takes your status effects and spreads it to all of your enemies based on electricity, an electricity proc. Melee Vortex grabs and groups enemies on a magnetic proc. Fortification adds armor on kill. And Duplicate, I can't really recommend this too much, but on base critical hits, it gives a scaling up to 100% chance for your attack to strike a second time. Crescendo on finisher gives you initial combo. So these are going to be more circumstantial. They're really broken on things that they apply to. But for the big one, in terms of what we're talking about, diminishing returns, is going to be melee retaliation. So we can take it off, and we can see that our base damage went down, which is where it's applying. So we went from 887 to 1153. Let's give ourselves some shields. That should be enough. And our damage went up because we increased the number of shields that we have, or the amount of shields that we have. So it increased the bonus, and now here's where we start getting into diminishing returns. And it's going to be up to personal taste. I have seen people run no condition overload retaliation builds because the damage bonus on retaliation is just so high. But it's more circumstantial, like you'll see it with Hildren, you'll see it with like Harrow, especially people running Rock to Dark Dagger, where you get the shield refresh. It is a lot of damage. Most of the time, I would say just enjoy the damage increase because the damage is so high, it's relevant even with like a faction mod. Because on average, say like with the weapon that we have now, it's impact / corrosive. Condition overload is only going to be getting with this weapon 3 statuses to chew on. Obviously, we're going to get viral from the Panzer. So 4 statuses, which will be what, 320? And that's part of the issue, is that even with the Panzer, it's 4 statuses. It's going to give me 320% damage. But melee retaliation, if I am on a frame where I can keep it stacked, will give me 420. So it's either enjoy the bonus or take the opportunity to apply another multiplier. And I've seen people slowly running and like slotting in faction damage on like radiation electricity setups with like Harrow and Hildren, but again, that's getting into more circumstantial stuff. And this is where diminishing returns start to come in. Is it depends on what you're doing. But for the generic Starchart Steel Path build, literally just run something like this. Maybe a Dexterity Arcane on your secondary or something. Something where you're not, if you're running a melee setup. But this is a very, very, very generic build, right? It's just super middle of the road. So with stuff like this, diminishing returns still isn't an issue. And most of the time, okay, so let's talk about like, and we'll go back to the Baza. So some special circumstance where you might want to go hard in on one stat has a lot to do with what you're doing. We haven't put faction on here, but this time we are. This is going to be a deadhead build, and it's going to be for disruptions. Where, if it'll go, there we go. Where are you? Not that one. There we go. So Deadhead is going to give us damage. It's going to give us a headshot multiplier. It's going to give us weapon recoil reduction. One of the things we can do is with this, you start putting in work to make it easier to kill the enemy. So where normally you would be modding against the enemy's weakness, you're going to be removing the enemy's scaling, its scaling defense, and going straight after the health pool. So there's less things to worry about. So when you go up against like a Grenier, their health pool is weak to viral. We're going to outsource the status procs. We're going to try to get as much damage onto the weapon as possible. So we have the biggest stick to multiply our damage with. And because the damage is going to be so high, we can start to invest in the few things that matter to that. And this is where, even though it's diminishing returns, you're sort of searching for the strongest multiplier. And a decent setup for a level cap is something like this. If you are doing a Deadhead build, a ton of raw viral, you have your base damage, you have your additional multiplier, which is also your base damage, but galvanized aptitude for base damage, galvanized chamber for multi-shot, and on this we're going to be limiting ourselves to headshots. As much as I can, I'm probably going to miss. And our average crit multiplier is still the same, 2 mods, crit chance, crit damage, and we have our element, which does the best against the weakness of whatever we're shooting. And then, because we're out of multipliers, obviously we could do fire rate, but the weapon does have a decently high fire rate. Our final multiplier that we're going to be able to slot is going to be Bane of Grenier. And Vigilante, maybe we'll RNG some reds. So pretty basic. So you remember before we were scaling up. Nothing too fancy. Make sure everything's stripped. Okay. So without viral stacks, 8100, 15.7 on a headshot orange. All right, now we're gonna get some stacks. All right, we're now up to 1.2 million. If I could proc all of my multi-shot, each instance of damage is, what was that? 361 and 414. Let's prime. I missed. All right, 382 on a yellow. 271, so a little over half mil. 470k on a headshot. 351 on a yellow, or 354 on a yellow. 682 on an orange. 354 on a yellow. 354 on a yellow. So when you start removing things that you have to worry about, that you start running out of things, or the multipliers for your DPS, some of them start to become irrelevant. Like if I'm running this setup, 13 fire rate is fine because I'm one-shotting everything. It's not, with this sort of setup, you're not running like a looter shooter against like a horde. It's an aim trainer at this point. So because the fire rate is high enough, it's 13 shots a second, which is enough to, like 13 kills a second. It is an insane kill rate if you can do that. You're not going to be able to, but I'm just saying, like, the fire rate isn't low enough. It's not like 1 shot a second or like a half a shot a second. It's not so low. It's an issue and it's limiting your DPS. 13 kills a second is insane. So it's not our limiting factor, so we're not going to mod for it. Because we're dealing with raw damage, on a headshot, we take our best in slot arcane, which is because we're going for headshots, is going to be deadhead easily. We're going to try to prime the enemies as we go through. So galvanized aptitude is really good, especially when you're using a primer. Multi-shot is a straight up increase. Scope is a shit ton of crit chance. Critical delay is 200. Galvanized scope is what? 320. And it gets us the solid, consistent oranges. We obviously had some stacks fall off, but you get to like what? 170 something crit chance. Even with this, where it shows like 84, so we're mostly doing oranges. So the combination of both of them, super solid. We really don't have too many options. Technically, you could run what is it, hammer shot? You could run that here in place of like critical delay, maybe, depending on what your Riven is, if you have one. Sometimes that is appropriate. And then again, our dual elements to give us a big base damage increase to elemental weighting. And that's just kind of it. Like when you start changing what your weapon has to deal with, you can adjust your multipliers slightly, and maybe a mod or something just isn't appropriate for whatever you're doing. So it is what it is, but these are the main multipliers. Diminishing returns just isn't that big of a deal. And I'm going to be honest, even when doing level caps, unless you do something just dumb and like quadruple mod for crit damage to the point where you can't even get like crit chance onto it. Unless you really sacrifice like 3 mod slots for something. Like I've done like a strain build before, and you can throw like a Riven, Organ Shatter, Gladiator Might, Strain, I forget what it is. You can like quadruple mod for crit damage. It also means you're going to be missing elemental weighting, like being able to mod viral. So it is sort of what it is, right? Obviously those are fun, especially on Force Slash, but that's just kind of is what it is, right? But only in like hyper special circumstances does that stuff even gain ground to be part of an argument, right? But you know, diminishing returns just isn't that big of a deal. So talked a long time, but this is basically why, with very little math, is just because of what the standard multipliers are, you don't even get the chance to deal with diminishing returns too much. Other than that, have a good time, guys. Oh, and I hope you enjoyed the shit posting. I've been having some fun with that, learning editing a little bit. But have a blessed day, guys. Later.